There is a grey army that has marched across the world more times than anyone can count, and it has never once lost. It carries no banners, and it makes no sound at all, just row after row of identical crystal knights walking in perfect step across a land of giant mushrooms and broken mines, and everything they pass over goes still and lifeless as they grind it down into cold grey stone. They don't cheer when they win, because winning was only ever what they were always going to do. The part that should unsettle you is what comes after the army wins, because the moment a world has been scrubbed clean of every flower and every living soul, the whole army simply folds up and vanishes as if it had never been there, and then, slowly, that world grows back. Only so the very same thing can be done to it again at the end of the next age. All of this is the work of Jyggalag, the Daedric Prince of Order, and he might be the saddest and the strangest of all 16 princes, with a real case to be made that he is also the single most dangerous one of the whole bunch. The entire story hangs on a twist that I'm going to hand you right at the start, because you can't really understand Jyggalag without it. The cold grey knight who leads that army and the giggling, cheese-obsessed lunatic in the fancy coat that a lot of you already know as Sheogorath are not two enemies who hate each other from across some battlefield. They are one single being, one soul wearing two faces, fused together by a curse so cruel that it takes a while to really feel the full weight of it. So let me back all the way up and walk you through the whole thing from the beginning, because this is one of those stories where the more you understand, the heavier it sits on you. Let me lay the ground floor first so nobody gets lost. In the Elder Scrolls, you have two big families of gods. There are the Daedra, the spirits who gave up most of their power to help build the mortal world, the place where people actually live, and that building cost them dearly, because they came out of it weaker, with some of them basically dying in the act, which is why they mostly don't meddle in the world anymore. Then you have the Daedra, who gave up nothing to build the world because they never helped build it. They stayed out in oblivion, which is their own endless set of realms, and they kept every scrap of their power. The mightiest of them are called the Daedric princes, and mortals usually count 16 of them, each one ruling over a sphere, which is just a piece of how existence itself works, so that Mairunes Dagon is destruction and change by force, Molag Bal is domination and slavery, Azura is dusk and dawn, and Hermaeus Mora is forbidden knowledge, and so it goes on down the line. People love to call the Daedra evil, but that isn't really fair to what they are. They aren't evil so much as they are completely true to their own nature, and their nature just doesn't care about us the way we'd want a god to care. A Daedric prince is closer to a force than a person. Sheogorath is what madness would be if madness could put on a body and have a personality. Jyggalag is what order would be if order could stand up and carry a sword. That word, order, sounds pleasant the first time you hear it, because we tend to like order, and we like things tidy. You should hold on to that warm feeling for just a second though, because what Jyggalag means by order is not the comforting kind at all. What he means by order is the kind that ends the world. So, what exactly is Jyggalag's sphere? The lore calls it logical order and deduction, which sounds dry, so let me put it the way it actually works, because it is genuinely one of the creepiest ideas in the whole setting. Jyggalag doesn't just like things neat, because Jyggalag already knows everything that will ever happen, every action taken by every creature, whether mortal or Daedric, all of it worked out ahead of time, like a math problem that has exactly one correct answer. Every birth and every death, the rise of Tiber Septim, who would one day conquer all of Tamriel and become a god, the awakening of the Numidium, which was a giant brass war machine that could warp history itself, all of it written down and waiting on a shelf long before any of it ever happened. Think about what that actually means, because if you can predict every single choice a person will ever make, then their choices were never really choices in the first place, since they were always going to do the exact thing they did, and free will turns into a trick of the light, a comforting little story we tell ourselves while we run along rails we can't even see. That is Jyggalag's whole truth, since he believes that certainty is the only real thing, and that you along with your sense that you are a person making up your own mind, all of it is an illusion, because there are no individuals, there is only the pattern working itself out exactly the way it was always going to. That is the sphere of order, and it is not tidiness, it is determinism, the death of surprise, a universe understood so perfectly that nothing inside it is ever free again. The depth of that idea shows up best in one detail, which is that Jyggalag had a library, and not a normal library at all, because this was the great library of Jyggalag, and what it held wasn't history. It held the formulas, the exact predictions of absolutely everything, every action ever taken by anyone, anywhere, already solved. The library could tell you precisely what a man in a city that had not even been built yet would say to his wife on some ordinary morning thousands of years down the line. It was the very height of logic and deduction, a place where the future had already happened, because all of it could simply be calculated. The library also had a keeper, and his name is Daius of Mytheria, who is one of my favorite small characters in all of the Elder Scrolls because of what he actually is. Daius was Jyggalag's chamberlain, his right hand, the one who handled all the dull everyday business of running a realm, all the little tasks a prince of order found beneath himself, though he is far more than a butler, because the way he describes himself, he does not merely keep the knowledge, he is the knowledge, the last of the great library, walking around in the shape of a man, the precise predictions of all of past and future poured into one immortal person and then left alone in a hole in the ground. As for what Mytheria actually means, we honestly don't know. It might be the old name of Jyggalag's realm, back when he still had one, but the lore never spells it out, so anyone who tells you for certain is only guessing. I lean toward it being the name of his lost kingdom, mostly because Daius of Mytheria reads like Daius of that place that's gone now, but I want to be straight with you that this is a hunch of mine and not a fact. Hang on to Daius, because he comes back later, and he turns out to be the reason we know most of what we know about who Jyggalag used to be. The way Jyggalag shows up tells you everything about the idea behind him. He appears as a knight, but an enormous one, towering over everything around him, and his armor is made of a pale, crystalline material that looks almost like frozen glass, and all of it is gray, the exact gray of a sky with nothing in it. He seems to carry a giant claymore made of that same crystal, the sword of Jyggalag, though there's a funny behind-the-scenes wrinkle here, which is that in the actual game, his sword is built into his body model, and he technically attacks you with his fists, while on screen and in the story it reads as a massive crystal blade, and the blade is what matters for the legend. He doesn't sneak, and Sheogorath describes that better than I can, in his own mad way, when he says that Jyggalag walks, or he runs, but he never skips and never sidles. He simply comes straight at you and destroys everything in his path, with no flair and nothing you didn't see coming. He doesn't even carry a fancy cane like a proper showman of a prince would, because he's the giant bone-cleaving sword type instead. The words the lore actually reaches for to describe him are things like bleak and colorless, and those aren't really insults. They're the whole point, because Jyggalag has had every original thought stripped out of him on purpose, since originality is a kind of chaos, and chaos is the enemy. The army he brings is just smaller copies of that same idea. The Knights of Order are crystal soldiers spawned out of glowing obelisks, every one of them identical to the last, and not one of them carrying a single thought of its own. Behind the Knights come the Priests of Order, and this is where one of the most gut-punching details lives, because the priests are not all summoned things, since some of them are the locals, and when order comes marching, some of the people of the realm get so terrified that they switch sides and join the very thing that is about to erase them, becoming its priests, just to feel safe for one more day. Order doesn't only conquer you, it actually convinces some of you to help it do the conquering. The obelisks are the key to the whole machine, because they strengthen Jyggalag and keep spitting out fresh knights, so shutting the obelisks down is what weakens him, and leaving them standing is what lets the Grey keep coming forever. The heartbreak underneath all of this is that Jyggalag was not always a curse, because once, a long time ago, he was a king. He tells it best himself, and I'm going to lean on his own words because they're some of the finest writing in the game. Once I ruled this realm, a world of perfect order. My dominion expanded across the seas of oblivion with each passing era. Sit with that for a second, because in the time before recorded history, before there were any books to write any of it down, Jyggalag had a realm of his own, and it was growing, and not slowly either, because every single era it got bigger. His perfect order spread out across the seas of oblivion, swallowing more and more of that infinite space, and nothing in it could stop the spread, because the whole nature of his realm was that everything inside it bent to one will and one pattern, with no resistance and no surprises anywhere. To the other princes, watching from their own realms, that grey tide was the stuff of nightmares, getting bigger every era, never stopping and never even slowing, eating oblivion one piece at a time. They were facing a prince whose entire thing is that he already knows the ending, and you cannot really fight something that has already calculated your every move before you make it. So they didn't fight him because they couldn't, and instead they did something far worse. The other Daedric princes, fearful and jealous of his power, cursed him, and the curse they chose is the cruelest thing in the whole Elder Scrolls once you really look at it. They did not kill him, and you probably can't kill a Daedric prince for good anyway, so they did something cleverer and more vicious than killing ever could be. They turned him into the exact thing he hated most in all of existence. They cursed him to live as Sheogorath, the Prince of Madness, the living embodiment of chaos. Everything Jyggalag stood against poured into the soul of the God of Order and made into his prison. The being who believed surprise was a lie became the literal god of surprise, and the being who knew every outcome became a giggling fool who can't hold a thought straight for 10 seconds together. That is the curse, and it is not death so much as it is mockery turned inward and made to last forever. It gets even more twisted from there, though, and this next part is what turns it from a sad fact into a real story. The curse came with a loophole, or maybe with a leash, and it's honestly hard to tell which of the two it really is. At the end of every era, Jyggalag is allowed to come back, so the curse lifts for a little while, the madness drains away, and the Grey Knight stands up again in his true form. The first thing he does every single time he returns is march on the Shivering Isles, which is the realm of his own mad self, and burn the whole thing to the ground, and this is the event called the Grey March. The Shivering Isles, if you've never been there, is Sheogorath's realm, and it is exactly what you'd expect the God of Madness to build. It is split right down the middle into two moods. One side, called Mania, is all wild creativity and bright color, loud and dazzling, with a dangerous edge running under it. The other side, called Dementia, is dark and gloomy, quietly cruel in the way a bad dream is cruel. Together, those two halves make up one realm of madness, ruled from the city of New Shiot, and the place is absolutely bursting with broken, lovable people. It is the most alive place you can imagine, which is exactly why Order wants it dead. So the Grey March arrives, and the Grey Army pours out of the obelisks, and the Knights of Order march across Mania and across Dementia, and they win, because they always win, and the most alive place in all of Oblivion gets scraped down to smooth, silent stone. The instant it's done, the curse snaps back into place and Jyggalag turns back into Sheogorath, and Sheogorath, who is the survivor of his own slaughter, has to crawl out of the wreckage and slowly, lovingly rebuild the entire Mad Realm from nothing, only to watch it get destroyed all over again at the end of the next era. This has gone on like that for who knows how many thousands of years, with him building the most alive place in all of creation only to become the thing that murders it, on, never able to stop, and on some level, never even able to remember clearly that it's happening to him, because remembering the truth of what he is would drive even the mad god mad. The god of madness keeps his own deepest memory locked away precisely because it is too much even for him, and that is the wheel Jyggalag has been strapped to since before history started. I want to spend a minute on the Shivering Isles itself, because you can't really feel the weight of the Grey March until you understand what is getting wiped out every era. This is the most alive and most personality-soaked corner of all of Oblivion, and Order treats every bit of it as a stain to be scrubbed away. The split into two halves is the whole heart of the place. On the Mania side, ruled in the old days from the bright court of a noble called Thaedon, you get creativity turned all the way up past the safe line, full of color and invention, but also tipping over into obsession and the kind of restless genius that can't sleep and won't stop. On the Dementia side, ruled from the gloomy court of a noblewoman called Sil, you get the dark half of madness, where the air is thick with paranoia and quiet plotting, where everyone is sure that the world is out to get them, and where sometimes the world genuinely is. Put those two halves together and you have madness whole, the soaring part and the sinking part sharing a single realm. The capital, New Sheoth, sits in the middle with its two districts, Bliss for the bright mood and Crucible for the dark one, and above it all rises the palace where Sheogorath holds court. The realm is guarded by two strange warrior peoples who can barely stand each other. The Golden Saints, also called the Ariel, are proud and shining, and they lean toward mania. The Dark Seducers, also called the Mascan, are shadowy and disciplined, and they lean toward dementia. They cannot stand to share a room, which is very fitting for a realm of madness, and yet both of them throw their lives away fighting the Grey when order finally comes. Guarding the way in, at least when you first arrive, is the Gatekeeper, a giant stitched together horror built out of the bodies and the suffering of everyone who failed to enter, a lurching thing made of madness and pain. Even the doorman of this place is its own little nightmare of a story. Now think about all of that going silent at once. The color drains out of it, the music stops in the middle of a note, the proud Golden Saints and the cold Dark Seducers get cut down in the same grey wave. New Sheoth is scraped flat, and the gardens and the Gatekeeper himself all get pressed down into smooth, perfectly ordered stone. A Grey March is not really a battle, it is a deletion, and afterward Sheogorath, who is the cursed remnant of the very god who did the deleting, has to build every scrap of that personality back from nothing, knowing full well it will all happen again. Once you understand the realm, the cruelty of the cycle finally lands with its full weight. I want to slow down now, because this is the idea sitting at the very center of Jyggalag. And if you take only one thing away from this whole story, I'd want it to be this. We are trained from childhood to think of order as the good thing and chaos as the bad thing. Order is the clean room and the train arriving on time, while chaos is the mess and the thing falling apart. So, the first time you hear about a Prince of Order facing off against a Prince of Madness, your gut tells you to root for Order, obviously, because madness has to be the villain. The Elder Scrolls turns that instinct upside down on purpose, and it does it cleverly. Remember the great library that predicted everything? The detail that unlocks the whole story is what happened to it, because when Sheogorath, in one of his eras, found that library, he burned it. He burned his own past self's single greatest treasure to ash, and the reason he gave is the key to all of it, since he said the library was an abomination because personal choice defies logical prediction. Put plainly, the library claimed it could predict every choice you would ever make, and the mad, chaotic Sheogorath looked at that claim and said no, because a real choice cannot be predicted, and the moment you can perfectly predict it, it stops being a choice at all, which means the library has to be either a lie or a prison, and either way, it has to burn. That is the entire fight in a single image, because order is not the kindly force keeping the streets clean, since order, followed all the way to its end, is a universe where nothing is ever free again, where every person is just a gear turning exactly the way the math always said it would, where surprise and choice get cleaned up as errors. Madness, for all of its drooling and its nonsense, is the only thing standing in the way of that ending, because madness means a thing can still surprise you, and madness means tomorrow has not been written yet. So, when Jyggalag wins a Grey March and turns the most alive place in Oblivion into smooth grey stone, that is not order beating chaos at all, it is death beating life and it is a solved equation snuffing out an open question. The reason the other princes were so terrified of him was never that he was simply strong, since plenty of princes are strong. It was that his nature, fully unleashed, ends the game for everybody, because a finished universe is a dead one. That is my read on the deepest layer of him, and I'll flag honestly that the lore never sits you down and lectures you in those exact words. The game hands you every piece, though, from the burned library to the dead silent stone, and it clearly wants you to feel that order, past a certain point, is just another word for the end. If the Grey March always wins, you might wonder how we ever learned any of this in the first place. And the answer is that at the very end of the Third Era, in the year 433, somebody finally broke the wheel. That somebody is you, or rather the player character of the Shivering Isles, the one fans tend to call the champion of Cyrodiil or the hero of Kuwatch. The way it all plays out is the best part of the whole story, so let me walk the entire thing through. It starts with a door, a strange door that appears in the world and opens onto the Shivering Isles, and through it you go into Sheogorath's realm of madness, where Sheogorath has a job waiting for you. He is worried because the Grey March is coming, and he knows, in the way you know a bad memory you can't quite bring yourself to face, that he is going to lose the way he always loses. So he chooses you to be his champion, the one who is finally going to do the impossible and stop it. You meet his chamberlain first, a dry and endlessly patient man named Haskill, who serves Sheogorath in much the same way that Deus once served Jyggalag, and that mirror is absolutely not an accident, so hold that thought for later. Haskill lays out the threat for you plainly, telling you that Jyggalag, the Prince of Order and the leader of the Grey March, has always been the thing that ends this realm, and that he will soon march again. You work your way up through the realm, through the courts of two mad nobles, through betrayals and a whole lot of very strange errands. And the dread keeps building the entire time, because order is coming, and every soul in the realm can feel it. The citizens start to crack under that dread, and some of them defect and become priests of order, just as they always do, because they would rather serve the thing that kills them than be surprised by it. Even the Duke, who rules under Sheogorath, betrays the realm and joins Jyggalag during the ritual, which the lore notes is the very first time in all of history that a Duke has ever turned, and that detail tells you how strong the pool of order becomes when the end is near, because people would genuinely rather be a cog in something certain than a free person in something doomed. Then the Grey March hits, and Sheogorath does something that confuses a lot of players the first time around, but it turns out to be brilliant once you see it. He vanishes right at the moment you need him most, so the god of the realm is simply gone, and he even tells you, almost casually, that he is never around when Jyggalag walks, because that is one of the rules. The throne sits there empty, and his real plan, the thing he has been quietly building toward this whole time, finally comes clear, because he has been trying to make a new version of himself. Another Sheogorath, a U-shaped Sheogorath who can sit on that throne and fight Jyggalag in his place, since he himself cannot be there for the fight. The reason he cannot be there is the line that ties the whole story together, straight from his own mouth, when he says, "Because he is me, I'm him. We're a bit of each other, really. I won't be here when he arrives, because I'll be him." Happens every time. The Grey March starts, order appears, and I become Jyggalag and wipe out my whole realm. That is the curse doing its work right out in the open. Sheogorath cannot fight Jyggalag, because the very moment Jyggalag shows up, Sheogorath turns into Jyggalag. So his only hope of ever breaking the loop is to build a second mud god, a mortal raised up into the role, who will still be standing on that throne after he himself has melted back into the enemy. And me to fight the him, he calls it. And he adds that it's simple, really, so long as you don't think about it too hard. So that becomes your job, to become enough of a Daedric prince to stop one. You go after the staff of Sheogorath, the symbol of his power, the one thing that might let a mortal actually hold the line, and to learn how to make it, Haskill sends you somewhere that ties the entire story into a knot. He sends you to the ruins of Knife Point Hollow, which, he warns you, was once a great library, and he tells you straight out to be careful in there, because the library is a thing of order, and it will still serve that end. Waiting for you in the dark of that ruined library is Deus of Miteria, Jyggalag's old chamberlain, the man who is all knowledge, the last surviving piece of the great library that Sheogorath once burned. Sheogorath could not bring himself to destroy Daius, in the way that you can't quite bring yourself to throw out the one object that proves who you used to be. So instead, he cursed Daius with immortality and hid him away in a hole to protect the realm from his knowledge. Now, at the very end, it is Deus, the servant of order, who tells you exactly how to build the weapon that will stop order. So the knowledge of Jyggalag ends up being used to defeat Jyggalag, and the whole thing eats its own tail, which is the part I love most about it. Daius tells you what the staff needs, and you gather the pieces, and then, in one last cruel twist, the forces of order poison the very wellspring of madness itself, the font that powers the realm, by tainting the pools of mania and dementia. Even this dirty trick takes everyone by surprise, because order is not supposed to do tricks, and Haskell is genuinely shocked by it, noting that Jyggalag has never had an original thought in his whole existence, and yet here is order trying subterfuge, which tells you that you, the mortal, have rattled the machine so badly that the pattern itself is starting to break. The single most unpredictable thing left in the realm turned out to be you. You cleanse the pools, and you forge the staff in the font of madness, and then comes the last quest, the one called the End of Order. Obelisks tear up the palace grounds while the Knights of Order pour out of them, and the Golden Saints and the Dark Seducers throw themselves into the grey to buy you time, dying as they do it. You race to shut down the obelisks, because the obelisks are what feed him, and when the last one finally goes dark, the surviving knights get yanked up into the sky, and everything explodes. And out of that explosion walks the thing itself, Jyggalag. Not a knight this time, but the prince, bigger than all of them, grey as a dead sky, carrying that crystal sword. He's not even slightly impressed by you, and he has a whole list of things to say while he tries to kill you, and every line of it drips with contempt, because to him you are a glitch, a mortal wearing the trappings of a god he has beaten 1,000 times before. He tells you that you hold the staff, but you are no Daedric prince, that your staff does not make you a Daedra, that this ends the way it always ends, and order shall reign, that you should kneel before the might of Jyggalag, that the Grey March is upon you. From his side of it, this is simply one more era and one more easy win, the math working out exactly the way the math has always worked out. And then, for the first time in the history of forever, the math is wrong. You beat him, and when Jyggalag falls, he doesn't rage and he doesn't curse you, because he does something far stranger than either of those. He stops, and for the first time in uncounted eras, he is free, and he gives a farewell that I think is one of the most quietly devastating speeches in the whole series. So I'm going to give it to you close to whole, because it earns that. Enough. I am beaten. The Grey March is ended. For millennia this drama has unfolded, and each time I have conquered this land, only to be transformed back into that gibbering fool, Sheogorath. It was not always so. Once, I ruled this realm, a world of perfect order. My dominion expanded across the seas of oblivion with each passing era. The other princes, fearful of my power, cursed me with madness, doomed me to live as Sheogorath, a broken soul reigning in a broken land. Once each era, I was allowed my true form, conquering this world anew, and each time I did, the curse was renewed, damning me to exist as Sheogorath. Now, though, you have ended the cycle. You now hold the mantle of madness, and Jyggalag is free to roam the voids of oblivion once more. I will take my leave, and you will remain here, mortal. Then, almost gently, he looks at you and isn't even sure what you have become, and he says, "Mortal? King? God?" It seems uncertain. This realm is yours. Perhaps you will grow to your station. Fare thee well, Sheogorath, Prince of Madness. And with that he is gone, The Grey Prince walking off into the empty dark of oblivion, free for the first time since before the world even had a name, and you, a mortal who wandered in through a strange door, are left standing on the throne of madness with a new title and no real idea what you've turned into. He even leaves the sword of Jyggalag behind, sitting on a pedestal in the throne room like a trophy, or maybe like a thing he simply doesn't need anymore. That is the moment the wheel finally broke, not with a hero killing a villain, but with a tired god being set free from a punishment older than memory, by the one creature his perfect math could never account for. Two things walked out of that throne room, and both of them matter. The first is Jyggalag himself, free at last, leaving the Shivering Isles to roam the voids of oblivion. What a freed god of order actually does with himself after thousands of years of forced madness is something we honestly don't know, since the games haven't told us since. His old Chamberlain Daius did take a guess at it, though, and the guess is worth repeating because it's chilling. Since Daius figured Jyggalag might go looking for revenge on the princess who cursed him, or he might be chasing some higher goal we can't even see, perhaps never returning to the Shivering Isles at all. I want to be upfront that this guess comes from an interview-style source outside the main games, so you should treat it as flavor rather than gospel, but it's worth sitting with anyway, because a god whose whole power is knowing exactly what everyone will do, now loose in oblivion with a grudge against every other prince and all the time in the world, is not a comforting thought for anyone. The second thing that walked out is you, the champion, who became the new Sheogorath, the new Prince of Madness. The Elder Scrolls didn't drop that thread either, because years later, in Skyrim, you can actually meet Sheogorath again. And there are strong hints all through that conversation that this Sheogorath is the same person, the old hero of Kuwatch, who took up the mantle. He talks about having been there for the whole sordid affair of the Oblivion Crisis, rambling on about butterflies and blood, and the fox, and the severed head, and the cheese. And he speaks fondly of that Martin fellow who turned into a dragon god, and he references things only the champion of Cyrodiil would have any reason to know, and the most popular read among fans, which is honestly the one the writers seem to be winking at, is that yes, the mortal hero of the fourth game grew into the role, and is now the mad god you bump into in the fifth one. The lore never carves it into stone, so a careful person says it's very likely rather than certain, but it's about as clear a wink as the series ever gives you. That leaves a genuinely strange question hanging in the air, because if you, the mortal, became Sheogorath while the old Jyggalag Sheogorath was set free, then there appear to be two of them now. A freed Jyggalag wandering oblivion, and a brand new mad god who used to be a person from Cyrodiil. The curse that bound order and madness into one soul got cut, and the two halves went their separate ways, which is a very odd outcome for a Daedric prince, and the lore just lets it sit there unresolved, which honestly suits a story about madness. There's a smaller detail here that I think is one of the most haunting pieces of the whole thing. Even Sheogorath, the version of him who knows full well what he used to be, keeps the memory of being Jyggalag locked away and suppressed, because actually remembering, really feeling what it was like to be the cold, grey god of order, is enough to drive even the god of madness mad. Madness is his entire nature and his comfort zone, and yet the truth of his own past is still too much for him to hold. One time, somebody used that against him, because in the card game Elder Scrolls Legends, there's a story where a Dunmer named Talim Rend actually beats Sheogorath at his own game, and he doesn't do it with a sword. He does it by forcing Sheogorath to relive his memories as Jyggalag, making him look straight at the buried truth of what he is, and it works. The thing that can break the mad god isn't more madness, it's order, the memory of the cold and colorless king he used to be and was punished into forgetting. To get that audience in the first place, Talim was guided by Daius, the keeper of knowledge, to the last surviving obelisk of order, where he recovered the lost sword of Jyggalag, and the sword itself was the key that forced the meeting. Even ages after the curse broke, the relics of order still hold power over the realm of madness, so while the wheel may have stopped, the gray never fully washed out. That sword deserves its own moment, since the Sword of Jyggalag is a Daedric artifact, a giant claymore made of the same pale silvery crystal as the Knights of Order, completely unenchanted, just a slab of perfect cold order shaped into a blade. People compare it to the Staff of Sheogorath, the two relics of the two halves of one cursed god, though whether the sword carries as much deep meaning as the staff is something nobody is quite sure about. There's a neat wrinkle to it, which is that even though Jyggalag was basically a forgotten name for most of history, replicas of his sword were already floating around the world as early as the year 582 of the Second Era, the time of the online game. So somebody out there knew enough about the Lost Prince of Order to copy his blade long before most of Tamriel had any clue he existed. In that same online game, there's also a collectible called Clockwork Jyggalag, which quietly ties him to Sotasil and the Clockwork City. And that's a thread I want to come back to in the theories, because it's a good one. Before I get into the theories, I owe you an honest behind-the-scenes note, because telling you the truth has to include the truth about how the story got made. Jyggalag did not start out as some grand master plan. The name first showed up in an in-game book called On Oblivion, written by a character named Morian Zenus, where the Daedric princes get listed off. And the real reason the name is in there, according to the writer Ted Peterson, is almost funny, because he basically tossed it in as a spare, an extra Daedric prince, just in case Bethesda ever needed one down the road, a name left on a shelf, waiting. Then, years later, somebody did need one, and they reached up and grabbed Jyggalag off that shelf and built the entire tragic heart of the Shivering Isles around him. There's even an in-universe joke baked in about it, because one of the writers suggested that the in-world scholar Morian Zenas only knew about Jyggalag as a prince at all, because the other princes were playing a practical joke on him, feeding him a fake name. I love that, because it means the lore itself has a built-in wink about the messy way the character was actually born. None of that makes Jyggalag any less great as a story, but you should know it, because a real fan knows the seams, and the seams are part of the fun. This is where I leave the solid ground and wade into the stuff fans argue about and the stuff I personally believe. And I'll keep flagging what is lore and what is guesswork, because that line really matters. Start with a piece of deep lore that most people skip past. Way back at the start of everything, before there were gods or worlds, the Elder Scrolls says there were two forces. One is usually called Anu, and he stands for stasis and order, the idea of things staying the same and staying whole. The other is called Padome, and he stands for change and chaos, the idea of things breaking apart so something new can form. Everything that exists came out of the mixing of those two, and the constant tug between staying the same and becoming different is the engine the whole universe runs on. What should make your eyebrows climb is what comes right after. The Daedra, all of them, are supposed to be children of change, which is to say they are Padomaic, and their whole family belongs to the becoming different side of the family tree, because that is what makes a Daedra in the first place. Every Daedra except Jyggalag, that is, because Jyggalag's entire nature is stasis, the end of change itself, a frozen, finished universe, which is not the change side at all, it is the Anu side, the exact opposite of what a Daedra is supposed to be down at its very root. So here is a fan reading I find genuinely convincing, and I'll be clear that it's a reading rather than a stated fact. Jyggalag is a contradiction wearing Daedric clothes, a being of pure stasis sitting right inside the family of pure change, and that is why the other princes didn't merely dislike him, they feared him down in their bones, because he wasn't a rival to them, he was an enemy of the very thing that made all of them exist. If his order ever finished spreading, the change engine of the universe stops, and when that engine stops, every Daedra stops along with it. They didn't curse him out of jealousy over a bigger kingdom, they cursed him because he was slowly, every era, killing the entire concept of oblivion itself. The cleverest and cruelest way to neutralize a being of pure stasis is to drown him in pure change, to turn the god of order into the god of madness. And that is not only poetic, it is very likely the only weapon that could possibly work on something like him. That is why the curse is the exact shape that it is. You'll see people online call Jyggalag the strongest of all 16 Daedric princes, and I want to handle that carefully because it's about half true and half hype. The true half is solid enough, since his power fully unleashed scared every other prince into ganging up on him, and a coalition of gods cursing one single god is not a thing that happens to the weak kid in the class. His sphere, perfect prediction, is arguably the scariest power in the entire setting, because knowing every outcome means you can never really be outplayed, and his realm was beating everyone else's just by existing, eating oblivion era after era with nothing able to slow it down. The hype half needs a cooler head, though, because most powerful in the Elder Scrolls is a slippery idea. Since the princes don't fight on some power level chart, they work more like aspects of reality than fighters with stat sheets. Part of why Jyggalag gets crowned the strongest is simply that his story is dramatic, and players fall hard for an underdog with a tragic backstory. So my honest take is that he's plausibly the most dangerous prince, in the very specific sense that his nature, if it ever ran free, would end all the others, but being the most dangerous to the whole system and being able to win a straight one-on-one duel are not the same claim, and the lore never actually ranks them against each other. Anyone who tells you flatly that Jyggalag would beat every other prince in a fight is making it up. What we can actually say is that all of them together were frightened enough of him to act, and that's the real evidence, and it's plenty. The lore leaves one gap wide open here, and I'd rather sit inside it than paper over it, which is the simple question of how the other princes managed to curse Jyggalag at all. Daedric princes are supposed to be more or less impossible to truly destroy, and they generally can't just reach into one another's nature and rewrite it on a whim. So how did a group of them fundamentally transform one of their own, fuse him together with his exact opposite, and then bind the whole thing into a repeating cycle tied to the turning of the eras? The lore does not say not really, because we get told that they did it and we get to see the result, but the actual mechanism is left blank. And I think that blank is interesting, because it hints that whatever they pulled off took something extraordinary, maybe a level of cooperation the princes basically never reach, since they hate one another almost as much as they hated him. The one time in all of history that Myrun's Dagon and Molagbal and the rest of them actually worked together on anything, it was to take Jyggalag down, and that alone tells you how badly they wanted him gone. My own guess, and it is only a guess, is that the curse leaned on the deep machinery of Anu and Padumai themselves, turning the change side of reality against the one being who was all stasis, but the books never confirm it, so I'm flagging that as my reading and nothing more. Now back to that Clockwork Jyggalag collectible, because it points straight at one of the richest threads in all of this. There was a Dunmer named Sotha Sil, one of the 3 god kings of Morrowind, a tinkerer and a planner who built an entire mechanical world called the Clockwork City, where he tried to remake creation into something orderly and perfect, something finally free of the cruelty of the gods. There's a line in the lore that gives me chills every time I read it, where it's said that of all the Daedra, only the Grey Prince of Order, meaning Jyggalag, truly knew his own nature and went mad in the knowing. It's also said that the Daedra fear wisdom and order, and because Sotha Sil's whole project was wisdom and order, they feared him above all other mortals, for the very same reasons they feared Jyggalag. You can hear the rhyme in that, because Sotha Sil is, in his way, a mortal trying to do what Jyggalag did, imposing order onto a chaotic and painful world, and building a perfect, predictable machine, and the Daedra fear the mortal for the same reason they curse the god. The question fans love to chew on is whether the two of them are connected by more than theme, whether Sotha Sil was inspired by Jyggalag or walking the same doomed road. The lore sets them side by side on purpose and lets you wonder. I don't personally think they're secretly the same being or anything that wild, but I do think the writers are using Sotha Sil to ask the Jyggalag question in a human key, which is what happens when someone decides the answer to a cruel and chaotic world is to make it perfectly orderly, and in both cases, the answer the setting gives back is nothing good, with everyone nearby growing very afraid. This one keeps me up a little, because the champion broke the Grey March, freed Jyggalag, and became the new Mad God, which is wonderful. But the curse had a rule, and the rule was that it renews itself every era, so you have to ask whether it's actually over, or whether we just watched one unusual turn of a wheel that is still quietly turning. The hopeful read, and the one the game clearly wants, is that it's genuinely broken, that a mortal did the impossible, that the cycle has ended and Jyggalag is free, full stop. The darker read is that being free to roam oblivion might only be a longer leash, and that the deep machinery of order and madness can't really be unmade by one mortal in one afternoon, and that somewhere far down the line the Grey could come marching again, much the way the world itself ends and restarts in great cycles in this setting. I lean toward the broken read because the story clearly wants its ending to mean something, and I don't enjoy cheapening a good ending with a, well, actually, but I'll admit honestly that the setting's own rules leave the door cracked open, and that's probably on purpose. Here is the idea I keep circling back to, and I'll mark it clearly as my own interpretation built on top of the lore rather than something a book states outright. There's a deeper layer to the whole Elder Scrolls, where reality is something like a dream being dreamed by a sleeping god, and where the most enlightened beings in the setting reach a state of knowing they're inside that dream, while somehow still keeping themselves real. It's heady stuff, and the games only ever hint at it, but if you take that frame seriously, Jyggalag becomes frightening in a brand new way, because what is a dream the very moment it becomes perfectly predictable? It is over, because a dream where every image is already known, where nothing can surprise the dreamer anymore, isn't a dream at all. It is just a fact sitting there, and the dreamer either wakes or the dream simply stops, because there's nothing left inside it to dream. That is what I think Jyggalag actually is, underneath the grey armor. He's not a conqueror who wants a bigger kingdom. He's the universe trying to finish itself, to solve itself completely, and predict itself completely, and, in the doing, to end. The reason madness of all things is the only thing that counters him is that madness is the one part of reality that flatly refuses to be solved. So as long as a single mad, unpredictable thing still exists, the dream keeps dreaming and reality keeps going. The saddest joke buried in the whole story is that the thing keeping all of existence alive is the giggling fool in the silly coat, while the thing that would lovingly and logically end all of existence is the calm grey knight who only ever wanted everything to make perfect sense. I find that genuinely beautiful, and I want to be clear one more time that I'm building it out of hints rather than quoting a rulebook, but every piece the game hands you points the same direction, from the burnt library to the colorless dead stone, and they all whisper the same idea, that perfect order is just a polite word for the end. Something that makes Jyggalag feel much bigger than one expansion's villain is that once you've got his idea in your head, the notion that perfect order equals the end of life, you start to see the same warning told over and over across the whole series, wearing completely different costumes each time, and it is always a warning. The Dwemer, the Deep Elves, were the smartest people who ever lived, all logic and cold machinery, and they tried to use cold calculation to reach something like godhood, and what they got for it was disappearance. Every single one of them gone in a heartbeat, with the leading guess being that their own attempt to engineer divinity is exactly what erased them. Logic pushed all the way to its end, and the reward was deletion, which rhymes with Jyggalag so hard that it can't be an accident. The Numidium, that giant brass god machine that Dwemer built and others later used, was a thing that could rewrite history itself by force, a walking piece of pure order with no soul inside it, and using it tore reality so badly that an entire age had to be smoothed over with a thing fans called the warp in the West, where many contradicting outcomes were all somehow made true at once. Order turned into a weapon, and the weapon cracked the world. You can even hear it in the high elves of the Thalmor, the proud Altmer who, in the deepest fan reading of their goals, don't simply want to win a war, but want to unmake the mortal world entirely, to undo the messy and painful act of creation and go back to the pure, changeless state that came before. I'll flag clearly that the most extreme version of that is fan interpretation stitched together from hints rather than a plainly stated plan, but notice the shape of it anyway. The desire to end the chaos of living by returning everything to a perfect and frozen stillness, which is Jyggalag's dream wearing elven robes. So Jyggalag is not a one-off at all. He's the cleanest and most honest face of a fear the whole series keeps circling back to, the fear that the thing which finally kills us won't be a monster or a war, but the quiet, well-meaning wish to make everything make sense, followed all the way down to the bottom. Every time that wish shows up in the Elder Scrolls, it ends in silence and stone, and Jyggalag is just the one who says it out loud. One last theory, and I'm putting this one all the way out on the speculation branch, so take it as a fun what-if and nothing firmer. There's a strange figure in the lore named Pelinal Whitestrake, a kind of holy berserker out of the distant past who slaughtered elves in the name of a goddess, and he carries a lot of odd qualities that don't fit a normal man at all. Some readers have noticed hints of the mechanical and the cold inhuman purpose around him, and a small group of fans like to tie those threads very loosely to ideas of order. Whether Pelinal is connected to Jyggalag in any real way is something no solid lore actually supports, and most serious lore folks would tell you to pump the brakes hard on it. I bring it up only because you'll run into the theory if you go deep enough into this stuff, and I'd rather you hear it from someone who will tell you straight that it's thin, because it's a campfire story fans tell, not a thing the books hold up. File it under fun to imagine, and please don't quote me on it. So that's Jyggalag, the prince who was once a king, whose kingdom grew so perfect and so endless that every other god in creation united out of fear to stop him, and who they could only stop by turning him into the one thing he despised. He is the god of order, locked inside the god of madness, building the most alive place in all of oblivion over and over again, only to burn it down over and over again, never able to remember clearly why, never able to win his way free, until one ordinary mortal walked through a strange door and did the single thing his perfect math could never predict. He's free now, somewhere out in the dark between the realms, and the Grey Knight is walking, not skipping and not sidling, just walking straight ahead the way he always walks, toward whatever a freed god of order decides that he wants, which might be revenge on the ones who broke him, or might be something bigger and colder than we can even guess at. The lore goes quiet right there, and honestly, I like that it does, because some stories are better with the last door left open. The thought that stays with me most, though, is a simpler one. We spend our whole lives wishing things were more orderly, wishing the mess would stop and the world would finally make some sense. And Jyggalag is what it looks like when you get that exact wish granted all the way to the end. A world that makes perfect sense, where everything is already known and nothing can ever surprise you again, would be silent and utterly dead. Maybe the madness is the part worth keeping after all.